3 months after my stroke, my daughter pushed a stack of papers across a conference table and smiled at me. "Dad, you don't need to worry anymore. Everything's taken care of." I glanced down at the last page, then I froze. At the bottom was my signature approving the sale of the trucking company I'd spent more than 40 years building. The problem was simple. I had never signed those papers. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, trucking wasn't just my business. It was my identity. When I was 26, I bought a worn-out truck with money borrowed against my house. During the day, I drove freight across 3 states. At night, I crawled under the truck fixing whatever broke. Some weeks I barely slept. Some months I barely made payroll. But little by little, things grew. 1 truck became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became a fleet. Eventually, the company employed more than 200 people. I knew many of those drivers by name. I watched their kids grow up. Some of them had worked beside me for decades. The company wasn't just mine. It was part of an entire community. My wife Margaret helped build every piece of it. When money was tight, she handled payroll from our kitchen table. When customers called after hours, she answered the phone herself. Whenever I thought about giving up, she was the one who pushed me forward. Then cancer took her. 3 years later, I still reached for my phone some mornings before remembering she wasn't there. After she passed away, my daughter Emily became the person I trusted most. She was capable, smart, confident. I was proud every time I saw her walk through company headquarters. I believed she cared about protecting everything her mother and I had built. Then I had a stroke. The doctors called it mild. I was lucky. My speech was slow for a few weeks, and I spent time in rehabilitation, but physically I recovered well. The strange part wasn't the stroke. It was how people started looking at me afterward, especially my daughter. "Dad, you should rest. Dad, let us handle things. Dad, the company will survive without you." At first, those words sounded loving. Looking back, I realized they were laying the foundation for something else. The first thing my daughter asked was for me to stop attending management meetings. "Just until you're fully recovered," she said. She sat beside me at my kitchen table and squeezed my arm. "You've earned a break." It sounded reasonable. So I agreed. A week later, I asked for the meeting notes. She promised to send them. Nothing arrived. A few days later, I asked again. Oh, nothing important happened. She smiled when she said it. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But after she left, I sat there staring at the empty chair. For the first time in 40 years, decisions about my company were happening without me. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking it. Recovery takes time. That's what everyone kept saying. Then the monthly reports stopped arriving. For decades, those reports landed on my desk every month without fail. Revenue, expenses, maintenance costs, fuel expenses, everything. Suddenly there was nothing. I called my daughter. "We're restructuring some accounting systems," she explained. "There are delays." The answer sounded prepared. Not wrong, just rehearsed. Something about it stayed with me. A few days later, I logged into one of the company accounts. Several transfers caught my attention. Large amounts of money moving between accounts. Nothing obviously illegal. Nothing that screamed fraud, but unusual enough to make me uncomfortable. When I asked my daughter, she answered almost immediately. The accountants recommended it. Which accountants? There was a pause, only a second. Then she changed the subject. I remember staring at my phone after the call ended. For the first time, I felt something I never wanted to feel toward my own child. Suspicion. I hated it. No parent wants to question their child, especially when that child is all the family you have left. So I ignored it. Then people started pulling away from me. Managers who used to call every week suddenly stopped. Employees became strangely quiet. Messages went unanswered. People who had once kept me informed now acted like they were afraid to speak. One afternoon, I ran into our operations manager, Robert Mills. He'd worked with me for 27 years. The moment he saw me, he looked uncomfortable. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah, sure." The answer came too quickly. Then he looked over his shoulder before lowering his voice. "Emily told everyone not to bother you." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He shifted his weight. "She said stress could affect your recovery." I didn't answer immediately. I just stood there looking at him. Because suddenly a lot of things made sense. The silence. The distance. The missing information. Someone had decided I no longer needed to know what was happening inside my own company. And that someone was my daughter. Over the following weeks, things got worse. Several longtime managers disappeared. Some retired unexpectedly. Others were replaced. None of those decisions came through me. Every time I asked questions, my daughter gave the same answer. "We're trying to help you." The words never changed, and somehow that made them feel less sincere every time I heard them. Then came the day everything changed. I drove to headquarters without telling anyone. The receptionist looked startled when she saw me. Not happy, not surprised, nervous. That bothered me immediately. As I walked toward the executive offices, I noticed several conference room doors were closed. Through one glass wall, I recognized people I didn't know: investors, corporate attorneys, consultants, people involved in acquisitions. I stopped walking. A bad feeling settled into my stomach. Then I opened the door. The room went silent. Conversations stopped instantly. My daughter stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I looked around the room. "What am I looking at?" Nobody answered. Then I noticed the documents spread across the table: purchase agreements, valuation reports, transfer schedules. I felt my chest tighten. My company was being sold, and nobody had told me. My daughter quickly closed a folder. "Dad, this isn't really the best time." I stared at her. I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. Not the best time. Nobody spoke. The silence was worse than any answer. Then my son-in-law stepped forward. He was always calm, always careful, always sounded like he was addressing a courtroom. "Harold, these discussions have already been authorized." "What discussions?" "The sale." For a second, my brain refused to process the words. Then he opened a folder. Inside was a signed authorization form. My signature sat at the bottom. I looked at it, then looked again. It was my signature, or at least a copy of it. My hands started shaking. "I never signed this." My daughter and son-in-law exchanged a glance. Just a glance. But it told me everything. They weren't shocked. They weren't confused. They expected this. "Dad," my daughter said carefully, "you approved these documents while recovering." "No. You may not remember." The room felt smaller, hotter. "You think I forgot signing away my company?" Nobody answered, and in that silence, I finally understood. For months they had been building a story where I was confused, forgetful, unable to make decisions, unable to run my own business, and now they intended to use that story to take everything. I walked out before my anger got the better of me. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room until sunrise, replaying every conversation from the previous few months. Every smile, every reassurance, every time they told me not to worry. The next morning, another surprise arrived. My doctor recommended additional cognitive evaluations. My daughter supported it immediately. My son-in-law already had paperwork prepared, conservatorship paperwork. They called it protection, planning, support. But by then, I could finally see the truth. The sale wasn't the end. It was the beginning. If they convinced people I was mentally incompetent, they controlled everything: the company, the house, my finances, my future. For the first time since the stroke, I was genuinely afraid. Not because of money, because I was watching control of my own life slip away. A week later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Robert was standing there. He looked nervous. "Can I come in?" The moment he sat down, I knew this wasn't a social visit. He rubbed his hands together, then looked directly at me. Emily's been telling investors you're never coming back. I stared at him. What? She's telling people your condition is getting worse. It isn't. I know. The room became very quiet. Then he said something I'll never forget. The takeover plan started a few weeks after your stroke. I felt something inside me finally break. Not my confidence, not my strength, my denial. For months I'd searched for innocent explanations. There weren't any. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't concern. This wasn't a misunderstanding. My daughter wasn't protecting me. She was replacing me. And for the first time, I stopped thinking like a father. I started thinking like the man who had spent 40 years building a business. Because if they wanted a fight, they were about to discover I wasn't nearly as helpless as they believed. The next day I began making calls. Quietly, carefully. I didn't confront my daughter. I didn't argue with my son-in-law. I didn't warn them. Instead, I started gathering facts. A few days later, our senior accountant asked to meet me privately. He looked terrified. We met at a small diner outside town. The first thing he did was slide a folder across the table. Harold, you need to see this. Inside were copies of internal emails, bank records, approval requests, transaction histories. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. The signatures authorizing the sale didn't match the originals on file. Someone had copied them. Someone had forged them. I looked up slowly. The accountant nodded. It gets worse. Then he showed me records from the weeks after my stroke, medication schedules, medical communications, internal emails between my daughter and my son-in-law discussing my recovery timeline. My stomach dropped. There were notes about keeping me away from major decisions while I was still impaired. There were discussions about accelerating the sale before I fully recovered. The picture became impossible to ignore. Everything had been planned, every delay, every missing report, every conversation, every attempt to isolate me. What hurt most wasn't the fraud, it was realizing how long it had been happening. The people I trusted most had been treating me like an obstacle. Over the next month, I worked with attorneys, investigators, and several longtime employees who were willing to tell the truth. Tubing evidence kept growing. Former managers confirmed they had been instructed not to communicate with me. Investors admitted they had been told I would never return to active leadership. Internal emails showed discussions about removing me permanently once the sale was complete. Meanwhile, my daughter and my son-in-law acted like everything was normal. They called occasionally, asked how I was feeling, reminded me to focus on recovery. Every conversation sounded different now. I could hear the manipulation underneath the concern. Eventually, they scheduled a final ownership transfer event. Investors.lawyers.board. Members, everyone would be there. They believed the deal was finished. They believed they had already won. The morning of the meeting, I put on the same suit I had worn when we opened our headquarters years earlier. When I arrived, several people looked surprised. My daughter looked uncomfortable. My son-in-law looked annoyed. Dad, nobody expected you today. I know, I said. Then I took a seat. The meeting began. Presentations were made. Numbers were discussed. Documents were prepared. Finally, my son-in-law stood and announced the final approval process. That was when I stood up. I think we're missing a few documents. The room went silent. An investigator entered. Then another. Folders were placed on the table. Screens lit up one by one. The evidence appeared. Forged signatures. Internal emails. Witness statements. Financial records. Medical communications. Nobody interrupted. Nobody. Could the facts spoke for themselves. Watched the color drain from my daughter's face. My son-in-law tried arguing, then explaining, then blaming misunderstandings, but every explanation collapsed under the evidence. One investor pushed his chair back, another closed his folder. The board members looked stunned. For months, my daughter and my son-in-law had controlled the story. Now the story belonged to the truth. Within an hour, the sale was suspended. The board voted to remove my daughter from her executive role immediately. Outside, council took control of the investigation. The conservatorship effort collapsed before it ever reached court. As people left the room, nobody looked at my daughter the way they had earlier that morning. The admiration was gone, so was the authority. The consequences came quickly. The sale was canceled. Fraud investigations began. Professional complaints were filed. More evidence surfaced. Every week seemed to uncover another lie. I didn't celebrate any of it. They were still my family. That part never stopped hurting, but I also refused to save them from consequences they had created themselves. Months later, I walked back into company headquarters. This time, nobody looked nervous. Nobody looked away. Employees stopped what they were doing. Some smiled. Some shook my hand. A few simply nodded. The board meeting that afternoon was short. The vote to restore my authority was unanimous. Afterward, I signed paperwork creating a scholarship fund in my wife's name for the families of truck drivers. As I finished signing, I paused for a moment. For months, other people had tried to make decisions for me, tried to speak for me, tried to replace me. Now every signature on the table belonged to me. Every decision belonged to me, and every mile ahead belonged to me too. I learned something through all of it. Trust matters, family matters, but neither should exist without accountability. The people who claimed I was too weak to lead were actually trying to take what I had spent a lifetime building. In the end, I didn't win by destroying them. I won by exposing the truth, keeping my dignity, and proving that I was never as powerless as they believed.